Hello and welcome to earlymusicsources.com. My name is Ela Motem, and today we'll talk about why Hebrew letters were sung in Lamentations settings and examine Orlando Di Lasso's ingenious ways of composing them. Renaissance counterpoint is such a vast and intimidating thing that whenever I find some hints as to how a certain section was composed, I try to learn as much as I can from it. In this episode, I will share with you what I found when looking at Orlando Di Lasso's Lamentations, and especially the contrapuntal techniques he used when setting the Hebrew letters to beautiful polyphonic melismas. But first, we have to talk about lamentation settings, and how and why they include Hebrew letters. Let's start.
The so-called Holy Week, and within it specifically the 3 days of Tenebrae, darkness, is one of the most intense and emotional times within the Catholic Christian calendar. It deals with the crucifixion and death of Christ, and includes special ceremonies and customs. One of them, for example, is to light the church with only a few candles and then extinguish them one by one in relation to the liturgy, thereby vividly symbolizing the darkness before the anticipated resurrection of Christ on the following Easter Sunday. These ceremonies also included especially expressive and beautiful music. A piece that you probably know, for example, is Gregorio Allegri's Miserere, a piece that was famous and weighted with myths throughout the centuries. Even we dedicated an episode to it. A central part of the liturgy for these days included readings, called lessons, from the Old Testament Book of Lamentations, where the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in the 5th century BC is described in an extremely vivid and harsh way. Originally, the Book of Lamentations was written in Hebrew, and its chapters had an alphabetic acrostic poem structure. The first verse started with the first letter of the alphabet, Aleph, Eicha yashva badad ha'ir. The second with the second letter, Bet, Bachot tivke balayla. The third with the third letter, Gimel, Galta Yehuda, etc., etc. When this book was first translated into Greek, this feature was obviously lost in translation. However, to somehow signify the original idea, the translators left the name of each Hebrew letter before each verse. In the famous Vulgata, the Latin translation of the Bible, which became the official version used by the Catholic Church, this convention was preserved. Each verse was preceded by the name of the Hebrew letter that originally started the verse, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, etc. In turn, this was also copied in this manner in the Catholic breviaries, the liturgical books according to which these ceremonies are conducted, and also in other musical liturgical books. As you see, for example, in this chant book, created by one of the Pope's singers in 1587, the verses as well as the letters have chant melodies. The names of the Hebrew letters, originally just signifying literally a detail lost in translation, are sung and are part of the liturgy.
Okay, so Hebrew letters were sung as part of the Holy Week liturgy as little preludes before each verse. Why is this interesting? Excellent question. Let me explain.
As we have seen, the lamentation lessons with their Hebrew letters were sung in chant, and this example is one of the most common chant melodies. However, starting from the late 15th century, we also have more and more lessons that were composed polyphonically, for 4, 5, and more voices, with practically every important composer making his own setting. Now, the main guide when composing polyphony, at least in the 16th century, was the text. It tells you how many notes you need in order to accommodate the number of syllables. It tells you where your melody should have an accent, to some extent where it should go up and where it should go down, and how the melody should be placed metrically. And this is even before mentioning the meaning of the text, which should affect many other factors of the composition. How then could one even start composing the Hebrew letters, which have only one or two syllables and no meaning? Well, you had to use melismas, repetitions, and get creative. And indeed, those letters were where composers could be truly free, creating something just for the sake of beauty with almost no constraints. These musical letters may be seen as equivalent to illuminated letters in manuscripts, and like them, apart from the obvious added aesthetic value, they help in accentuating the form, showing where one thing ends and another starts.
So, being interested in how composers went about composing the lamentation letters, these free-form little compositions, I looked at many of them. Many are indeed free of any visibly coherent technique of composition, while many others contain free imitations of some simple motifs, and others still incorporate the chant melody in one way or another. One composer who seemed slightly more systematic than others is Orlando Di Lasso. In examining his four-voice lamentations, one can almost see how his creativity developed, and how he eventually ended up with a rather specific and interesting composition technique for the letters. Let's see.
In the lessons for the first day of Tenebrae, called among other names Holy Thursday, Lasso applied a straightforward approach, using the chant melody as a basis for his polyphony. But as the chant melodies for all the letters are the same, it's clear that he would have to employ them using different techniques and get creative. Here is the first letter, the Aleph, as seen in the original manuscript, where each voice is placed in another corner of the page. You can see that he put the chant melody in the tenor voice, and more or less freely composed the voices around it. Here it is in modern notation. This chant-based setting, in fact, is not so far from what a group of improvisers from the time might have come up with, as we showed in our episode about Cantare Super Librum. There, we also showed the technique employed here by the bass, where it alternates between thirds and fifths with the tenor. Let's hear it. Some letters later, he puts the chant melody in the top part. Here you can see how the final note of the chant is not the end of the piece, it is held out and further harmonies are created around it, thereby prolonging the piece a little bit. This is a beloved feature in polyphony in general and may be stretched out even longer for many, many bars. Let's listen. In this letter, the chant melody is in the bass, and following basic vocal improvisation techniques, Lasso accompanies it in tenths in the alto voice. This is definitely something that could have been improvised. Let's listen. Also in this letter, the chant melody is in the bass, but transposed. Here, Lasso creates something that sounds like stretto fuga, where a certain melody is repeated in different voices while being still played. We talked about it in a past episode. It's only for the first 3 notes of the chant, but this idea of imitation, even if it's very free, is a very prominent feature in lamentation letters of many composers. As a last example using the chant melody, see this letter, where little imitated motifs of dotted notes are used, at the end even with diminished note values.
All the examples we have seen were taken from the lessons for Holy Thursday, the first day of Tenebrae. All the letters for this day were composed using the chant melody as a basis. It seems, however, that this was enough for Lasso, and for the following days of Tenebrae he stopped using it and instead employed another compositional technique. Let's see.
In another episode, we showed Santa Maria's technique of creating polyphony in 4 voices. You first present one duo, typically a subject and its imitation, then have it repeated by the other 2 voices in their octave, and fill in the gaps according to your fancy. There are a million ways to do it, of course. Do check out that episode if you want to refresh your memory. What Lasso does in many of his letters, after he abandoned the use of the chant melody, is quite similar but with a twist. He presents a duo made by a little subject and a counter-subject, then has it repeated by the other 2 voices but in its inversion. That is, the counter-subject that was first above the subject now will be below it, or vice versa. It is possible to flip between the subject and the counter-subject thanks to what is called invertible counterpoint. That is, when Lasso writes his counter-subjects, he makes sure to avoid certain intervals, so when they will appear in their inversion, they will still be contrapuntally correct. To demonstrate it, I extracted this subject and counter-subject from one of Lasso's letters. You see how the counter-subject works when it's above the subject. And also when it's an octave lower, now below the subject. This is called invertible counterpoint at the octave, as it can work in its place and when it's an octave lower. In order to write such counterpoint, apart from the normal rules, one must avoid using fifths, as these, an octave lower, will produce fourths, which, as you know, are not consonances. Anyway, now that we have this, let's see how simply Lasso turns it into a beautiful little letter. He puts the first duo in the tenor and soprano, subject and counter-subject respectively, and then immediately repeats it but inverted in the alto and bass, while the voices of the first duo continue, accompanying it with 3 consonances. Let's listen. What I like about this is that it's so compact and clear. Let's see another one, again starting only with the basic elements. Here, Lasso used invertible counterpoint at the 5th. That is, the counter-subject was written in such a way that it can also appear against the subject a 5th lower. Let's hear it in its place. And now a 5th lower. In order to write invertible counterpoint at the 5th, or as it is often used at the 12th, a 5th plus an octave, apart from the normal rules, one must avoid using 6ths, as these, when inverted, will produce 7ths. And now, let's see how Lasso turned it into a little piece of music. He started with the duo of the alto and tenor, and then once again inverted it in the basso and soprano, each in their own octave. Then he completed the voices of the first duo and added a tiny ending. Let's listen. This technique of invertible counterpoint brings variety into repetition, something that was very important to Renaissance composers. Lasso loved this technique so much that he used it, albeit with different intervals, in 18 out of 25 letters in the lessons of Good Friday and Holy Saturday.
This was really a tiny taste. If you find it interesting, I highly recommend that you check out all of Lasso's letters and analyze all the beautiful ways in which they are composed, and perhaps even try to compose some yourself. I could really sit here for hours and show you with much enthusiasm many beautiful letters of other composers. But since that's not how YouTube works, I will share with you only 3 more letters, taken from a recording I did recently with my group of the Lamentations of Emilio de Cavalieri.
Emilio de Cavalieri was one of the more innovative composers of his time. He challenged the musical norms in many ways in all his few surviving pieces, but especially in his Lamentations, which were composed sometime in the last years of the 16th century. In this letter, we see several interesting things. First, he clearly alludes to the chant melody in the opening soprano motive, that is then imitated throughout the letter. Second, like Lasso, he also employs a kind of invertible counterpoint. The motifs that appear on top on the first bar appear below the same accompaniment on the third bar. Third, he regularly employs harsh counterpoint, accented passing notes at almost every bar, diminished fifths, something that Lasso, for example, would probably not approve of, and even worse, at the end he introduces a leap into a dissonance, into a seventh. You might remember that Artusi famously accused Monteverdi of a very similar crime in exactly this period. Anyway, let's listen. Although these letters have no meaningful text, they are extremely expressive and somehow fit very well in between the very dark text of the Lamentation verses. And just to show you something completely different, in this letter, for a change, there is nothing but simplicity. A simple harmonic progression that is repeated 3 times, each time higher, and a cadence. In performance, my colleagues and I believed that such plain notes would have probably been embellished by singers in the past, so we did it as well. And for a last example, let's have a look at this letter, which demonstrates a very creative and free way to make imitations. It starts with a little subject imitated in stretto in the 4 voices and a cadence. Then the same subject appears in different voices, but often with some variation in its note values. Again, we get repetition, but with intricate variation. Truly an elegant sonic ornament. Let's listen.
This was our show about some beautiful counterpoint or lamentation letters. We hope you enjoyed it. Many thanks to Giovanna, Doron, and Jacob for joining me in the recording of Lasso's excerpts. Don't forget to check the special page on our website with all the footnotes and other extra information. If you enjoy early music sources, consider supporting us on Patreon. Comment, share, and like. See you next time at earlymusicsources.com.